So my name is Gillian Kerr, and I do work with the Government of Alberta. In the fairly new last 2 years, we merged the Department of Sustainable Resource Development and the Department of Environment, and with that has been a sort of change and refocus in our mandate. I've been working on ecosystem services within the department since around 2007. So what I wanted to focus on is more about how does government use it to enhance our decision making, our policy and planning. Right now, you'd all be familiar with the land use framework, regional plans. We also have biodiversity management frameworks being developed. We have a biodiversity policy that's in the internal belly of the beast right now. So how does ecosystem services help to inform our decision making, help us understand trade-offs, look at unintended consequences, and for something like biodiversity, which isn't as sexy to everybody, maybe the people in this room it is, how does ecosystem services, which Guy already talked about being very anthropocentric and unapologetically so, how do we use some of that information to really drive change in what we do in Alberta, both within the government policies and then what happens on the landscape? So I'm going to talk about just a couple of things. What are the drivers for government for using ES? What are some of the sort of generic ES approach that we've used internally? Also going to talk about a couple of GOA examples that we've used for ES to sort of demonstrate again, the breadth and the possibilities. And then some of the opportunities that we're looking at right now. I'd love to have some comments on those opportunities. And then what I think are some of the issues and concerns I have overall with this whole ES concept in Alberta. And part of it really goes to what Guy said when he opened up. Very simple definition. Benefits we derive from nature, and then after that things fall apart. Because it can be so complicated and it can be so different. And what I tend to use as my little, I don't know what age group everyone is, but I used to read choose your own adventure novels when I was younger. Turn to page 4 if you want to look at the lovely view off the cliff. Turn to page 8 if you want to dive off the cliff. So there's sort of that general, you can use it for many different things. Some healthier than others. So why is ES important? And this is, I cribbed this from the World Resources Institute. Ecosystem services underpin our economic, our social, and our environmental, and our human well-being. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the reason there's been a Department of Environment for over 40 years is we get it. Development has an impact on ecosystem services, but the missing link, particularly what I see in government, is this whole concept that these ecosystem services, natural capital, sustain everything. And because we don't have a natural accounting firm or natural accounting system of accounts right now, because we don't have all of our reporting that brings in these ecosystem services, we're missing a lot. And it's not just bad, you guys have done bad things, it's these opportunities to do things better, to look for economies of scale, to try to look holistically so that we're understanding unintended consequences up front instead of going, oh crap, here is something else we have to deal with now. That's my department. Department of Environment, we're kind of like the, we have to do something there. So if we could get out in the front end of it and do it a little bit more systematically, then we could probably have some better endpoints and goals and objectives. So what are the drivers? As I see them in the work that I've been doing, we have this rapid growth. Yes, we went through a bit of a blip, but it's gearing up again. If you look at if you try to get out on the highway going south in Edmonton right now, there's that block at Nisku because everyone's going to work in the industrial park. Natural resource and environmental management are complex, and they're more and more complex. We don't have some of those simpler issues that we might have had in the 70s and 80s. Nowadays, everything impacts something else. And understanding the dependencies and the interdependencies among things is well beyond the scope and the job description of most of the people I work with. That's not how we're not system thinkers. We have usually fairly, defined roles. And so this is the silo versus the holistic. So I run around and, people generally get a little bit nervous because they like their little piece that's defined, and I keep saying, well, we're going to try to blow that up. The other thing under Redford, so we'll see now that we have Prentice what's going to happen, but one of our big priorities, one of our 7 for the entire government, was this concept of integrated resource management. And what does that mean? Of course, these terms keep changing over time. We've heard of cumulative effects. We've heard of sustainable resource and environmental management. We have acronyms for all of these and more if you guys need some good bedtime reading, better than the MEC annual report. But how do we actually do integrated? We don't do it very well as a government, and I don't blame Alberta. I've talked to lots of other government people. Nobody does this well. So, and then part of that integration is being able to integrate those broad range of values and objectives that we have on the Alberta landscape. So we have the Duvernay-Montney play right now. We have some of the conflicts in the Southwest between ranchers and ATV drivers. We have things that we regulate like oil and gas, and then we have things that we don't regulate that are still having an impact. So how do we kind of look at this and try to integrate these values? So the musts, as I see them, are that we have to manage these increasing demands on the land. And if Alberta wants to have a good reputation and have our own social license to operate as a government, we have to figure some of this out. And we can't figure it out if we keep water quality in one act and water quantity in another act, and, you know, a biodiversity policy that's not necessarily connected to the wetland policy. Like, that's just the reality. So how do we do something about that? We have to understand risks. I think a theme that we talked a bit beforehand, risk is a big thing here, whether it's risk to reputation, risk to material risk. I need a little 101 with Geneva afterwards about all the things she said. But risk is a big deal. And Alberta, because we are like if you put kick the rest of Canada out, we're one of the richest places in the world, and we're getting heavy criticism for the way we do things. So, and that's not really going to go away. So we've got this whole idea of like, how are we going to do business better? How are we going to do integrated resource management? We have to demonstrate cumulative effects. We've talked about it for years. We've got it in the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, Chapter 3, cumulative effects. How do we demonstrate we're actually doing cumulative effects in a way that people can actually understand and go, oh, I'm proud of something that we've done here in Alberta. We've done this. And that speaks to what Geneva and Mark have already talked about, in that we need to be able to account for some of this stuff. We also have to meet the stewardship expectations of Albertans, and I'm really thrilled that Albertans care more and they want to have more say at the table. It's led to things like our WPACs and some of the regional planning councils, but is it enough, and are we doing it in the right way? Because Albertans care, and they're much more vocal than they were maybe 20 years ago from what I've been told. And then we have to enhance our social license to operate, and that's a big one for our forestry department and agriculture, in that we really are dealing with international markets that are expecting things that are a bit beyond where Canada has been to date. So what are ecosystem services? Well, I'm not going to get into the whole thing. Guy did a lovely start. But one of the things that we found really helpful is when we got together to do some work internally, we looked at this little, we cribbed this again from the World Resources Institute. You start with your asset, or you start with your ecosystem piece, and you get down to those really, what people care about, what are the benefits. We got so stuck having biologists, ecologists, policy advisors, the ISTs and all those people. We don't speak the same language, even within our own department, and we were all fighting about what we even meant by this and what the endpoints were actually going to be. And this is a group of people that chose to work together. Like, we really wanted to see this happen, and we still could not get on. It took us a month. We had to stop our project we were working on just to kind of figure out, what can we agree to for this work to actually get to the bottom of understanding what these benefits are and what we're doing to change those benefits. So it was a fascinating, mind-numbing process. An anthropological study should be done, in my opinion. Where do I point this thing? There we are. So some of the key things that we've been looking at internally is, how do we develop and operationalize an ecosystem service approach? Because I'll be honest, new shiny toys in the government get a lot of scorn from people that have been doing things a certain way. So I've had to actually do my own internal, not just me, our team, an internal education and outreach campaign, just so people don't think that we're taking work away from them. I'm like, aren't we busy enough? Like, should we not all be looking for someone to take our work away from us? Or, a way of doing this holistically? But no, we aren't quite there yet. We have to provide tools and information to actually demonstrate and inform cumulative effects, as I talked about. We have to test and determine how this approach can be used to inform trade-offs. Doing an ecosystem service approach, Geneva and Marion were very involved in a thing we did on wetlands in 2010-11. It is not easy, and you cannot pick a frivolous issue to focus on, or you will lose people. So you need to find something very tangible, something that means something to Albertans or your target audience, so that you can have them stay involved, stay engaged, and want to be involved in the product. So people have to see what's in it for them. That's an important lesson that I have learned. We also have to explore ways to provide that broader suite of the social, economic, and environmental perspectives. Again, when you work in a silo, you're a biologist, you may not be good at marketing, but if you get a biologist and a marketing person together, beauty can happen. So it's about trying to understand, how can we do this to show those multiple perspectives. So I'm going to flash by, because I know I don't have a lot of time, just with some examples of what we've been trying to do internally and with some of our groups in our little pilots and experiments. What are our dependencies on ecosystem services? Sit a group down that could be otherwise conflicting or fighting with each other because you have different mandates and say, let's not talk about our mandates, let's not talk about who wants what from whom. Let's talk about a landscape or an ecosystem like a wetland, and let's actually look at who is dependent upon what. And when we did this exercise as part of the Southern Alberta landscape and it became the SSRP, we found out that everyone, every group, depending on, it doesn't matter who you are dependent on water, they're dependent on erosion and sediment control or those kind of processes from rivers. And so when we started doing that, instead of coming to the table at a point of conflict and sort of the aggressive, like you want this and I will barter with you, we could start from a place of consensus. And I think that's another really important part about this ES, is that whether you're a human, okay, that's most of us, I guess. Whether you are representing a stakeholder group or whether you care about society in general, we all have those commonalities, and it's a fascinating place to start having a dialogue that could otherwise start with, pistols in pockets and, that kind of scary discussions. I haven't been in one of those yet, but I've heard of some people that were in them. Another example, SSRP, South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. When we mapped out qualitatively, because we don't have data is always an issue, when we mapped out looking at the valued ecosystem services or ecological goods and services, whatever you want to call them, the high value for all the 21 that we mapped in Southern Alberta, it's not really a big surprise. The Rocky Mountains, it's our headwaters, it's our contained forests, it's recreation. And then if you look at some of the other areas, you'll notice at the sort of the lower end, we've got some of the cities, right? So we've had a definite and obvious impact. So from a decision-making, a government decision-making perspective, when we're coming to regional planning, or if we're looking at sub-regional planning, or just even how a municipality wants to work, what do we want to do with those areas of high ES? How do we want to manage them? Is there a way of managing them to maintain, enhance, conserve, whatever the word is of the day? And then importantly, what do we want to do with areas that have low ES, either because we've impacted them already or because they just, that's their landscape, they haven't had a lot? Is that where we want to put our mega malls and our next Balzacs? Like maybe. Or is that an area we want to focus on bringing back to a certain level because it has so much capacity to go from low to medium to high? One of our other pieces that we did, I talked about this ES pilot on wetlands. We tried to answer for decision makers, approvals people at Calgary, Rocky View, and our people within the department that are working on wetland approvals. How can you enhance decision making by understanding the mitigation hierarchy for wetlands? Avoid, minimize, compensate. We always ask for the check. Developers will come and write a check to compensate. How do we actually get up to avoid? What kind of information and data and proof do we need to say about wetlands, like Mark's piece for ducks, that makes us say that this wetland is exceptionally important and we need to avoid it? We don't have that information readily available right now. Then we also said, how do we help them with understanding how to actually communicate values of wetlands in a way that a town would understand? Area structure plans going in. Let's go right through those wetlands and build, high profit, high tax revenue residential areas. Well, if we can understand the actual benefits that those wetlands are giving us, we might actually plan our area structure plans differently. And then finally, it was trying to understand cumulative effects. When we get a wetland approval in, it comes on a postage piece of this big on a massive map. How do we actually understand that little postage piece, because everyone's like, oh, it's not a big deal. Look at that little small area. That doesn't really count. Well, it does when the whole landscape is a bunch of postage piece development scenarios. So how do we bring that together? And we had quite a bit of success with that. This is just, I'm going to not even go in that because I don't have any time, but one of the other things we've done recently is we've developed a rapid assessment tool for ecosystem services for wetlands called WESPAB, terrible name, Wetland Ecosystem Services Protocol for Alberta. It is being modified right now for the wetland policy, which is the implementation on the white areas is now. That's upside down, I don't recognize it. Oh, okay, it's 2 minutes. And so this tool actually has, it allows us to actually, from a rapid 2 to 3 hour in a wetland, understand the relative effectiveness of that wetland against all of these functions and all of these benefits. And yes, it's a bit simplistic, but the way that's been done in Oregon is that these together are ecosystem services, because you need that function and that benefit to demonstrate. And so the fact that this is actually being used in something in the Alberta government means I can retire because I've done something useful that made it out of the government and into the public domain. So I'm ready to retire at 42. So I'm pretty happy with that. Yes, it's a huge plus for me. And this is just the manual that's out in the public domain. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can read some of those. Just all the things we can do with this tool. Ducks Unlimited is interested in it. The conservation groups are interested in it. The municipalities are interested in it. So if we have one tool to rule them all, the consistent data and information that we could start to collect in Alberta would go against all of this, limited data, we're not going to share, we're going to hide ours over here. So we're pretty excited about the potential. And then from an IRMS perspective, what we've been trying to do with the opportunity is how do we help with this new energy regulator that's got a new mandate? How do we help with that from an ecosystem services perspective? The new AMERA, that monitoring, evaluation, reporting agency, how do we infuse it so instead of media-based monitoring, we can start looking holistically at cumulative effects-based monitoring? And most of our impact right now has been in the regional planning. We've been involved in the SSRP, we're involved in the NSRP. Again, how do we help people understand from an outcomes and what's important to a region, some of the trade-offs that get made when you say we want economic development, or motherhood stuff like we want economic development, happy people, and a healthy environment. Well, guess what? There are trade-offs involved in that. So how do we inform them so we can make a little bit more appropriate and real decisions? So current issues for me, this is what I get concerned about. Common understanding, exactly what Guy said. People don't like the jargon, ecosystem services, it sounds too sciencey, so how do we get around that? We don't have a common understanding across Alberta because it's a new term. We don't have common acceptance in some of the evaluation methods, and part of that is because, unlike GDP that gets accepted, even though if you dug into the valuation methods for GDP, you would have just as many issues with them, that's accepted. It's in the common domain. So how do we move this to be a common domain thing? Data information, doesn't matter what you're doing, always an issue. Need for collaboration on research and application. My observation is it does seem that there are some groups that have gone off and said, oh, I want to make this my shiny toy. And what I keep pushing with our Alberta Innovates partners, although they're already ahead of the game, and other groups that are working, Mistakis, ahead of the game. I'm preaching to the choir. But we need to stop saying this is my piece and I own it and start talking about what we can do collectively. Because ecosystem services requires people to collaborate. It requires us to talk about issues across a broad span of stakeholders or whatever group you're working with. It will not succeed if we don't have that sort of come to the table, I can see what's in it for me. And the same with government. If we're going to do this stuff, it has to resonate with Albertans. It has to be legitimate, credible, and policy relevant. I stole that from a textbook that I read, but it's really relevant, we found internally in government. And then the focus on payments of ecosystem services. Marion's going to be talking about markets, and there's lots of good we can do, but the rush to look at building a payment for ecosystem service has failed in so many jurisdictions. So if we're serious about saying there are public goods that, oh, I got this unsmiley face. There are public goods that are exceptionally important that farmers or other landowners are producing, and we want to enhance those by helping them out, by having some sort of financial benefit. That is all good as long as you don't start from the premise, let's pay farmers, let's pay foresters, because even it doesn't work. They don't want that. We have to have a legitimate reason, issue, change that we want, and we need to put the time and energy into measuring that, and hopefully that'll lead into a bit of what Marion's doing. And with that, I will stop.